By the closing months of 1944, the Pacific War had evolved into a vast and complex struggle, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. What had begun in December 1941 with the dramatic attack on Pearl Harbor had gradually transformed into a grinding war of logistics, industrial capacity, and strategic positioning. The United States, with its enormous industrial power and growing naval strength, had begun to push the Japanese Empire steadily backward across the Pacific. Major naval battles earlier in the war had already reshaped the strategic balance. The Battle of Midway in 1942 had destroyed several of Japan's most experienced aircraft carriers, while later engagements, such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, severely weakened Japan's remaining naval aviation forces. American carrier groups were now able to strike Japanese positions across the Pacific with increasing confidence. Yet despite the dramatic nature of these large fleet battles, another, quieter form of warfare was steadily undermining Japan's ability to continue the conflict. Beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, American submarines were conducting one of the most effective naval campaigns of the entire war. Japan's empire depended heavily on maritime transportation. Unlike the United States, which possessed abundant natural resources within its own territory, Japan relied on materials imported from regions it had conquered across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, food supplies from occupied territories, and metals from distant islands all had to travel across enormous distances by ship before reaching the Japanese home islands. This reliance on long maritime supply lines created a vulnerability that American naval planners quickly recognized. Submarines became the ideal weapon to exploit that weakness. Operating independently across vast stretches of ocean, American submarines hunted Japanese merchant vessels, tankers, and military transports. Unlike large surface fleets that required complex coordination and support, submarines could patrol alone, moving quietly through shipping lanes where enemy vessels had little warning before an attack. Life aboard these submarines was extremely demanding. Crews operated in confined steel compartments filled with machinery, torpedoes, batteries, and essential equipment. Space was so limited that sailors often shared bunks in rotating shifts. Fresh food disappeared quickly during long patrols, and the air inside the submarine could become stale and humid after days spent submerged. Yet despite these conditions, the crews remained highly motivated. Each successful patrol could eliminate critical supplies destined for Japan's war industries. At first, the submarine campaign had been hindered by serious technical problems. Early in the war, American torpedoes frequently malfunctioned due to faulty detonators and depth control issues. Submarine commanders often watched in frustration as torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath enemy ships or struck targets without exploding. But by 1943, these issues were finally corrected. Once reliable torpedoes became available, the effectiveness of American submarines increased dramatically. Japanese merchant shipping losses began to rise at an alarming rate. Tankers carrying vital fuel supplies disappeared beneath the waves. Convoys that once moved confidently across the Pacific suddenly became vulnerable to unseen predators below. By 1944, the situation had become critical for Japan. Fuel shortages began to affect naval operations, and supply disruptions increasingly limited Japan's ability to reinforce distant garrisons. Despite these successes, however, certain targets remained extraordinarily difficult for submarines to destroy. Among the most challenging were aircraft carriers. These ships rarely traveled alone. They were usually protected by escort destroyers, equipped with sonar systems and depth charges designed specifically to hunt submarines. Aircraft launched from the carriers themselves often patrolled the surrounding waters, searching for the faint periscope wakes that might reveal an enemy submerged.
For a submarine commander, simply encountering an aircraft carrier was rare. Successfully attacking one was even rarer. Yet in late November 1944, near the entrance to Tokyo Bay, an American submarine would discover the largest aircraft carrier ever built. And the man commanding that submarine carried with him the burden of a missed opportunity earlier in the war. Commander Joseph Enright had once hesitated when faced with a similar moment. But now, fate was about to give him another chance.
Commander Joseph Francis Enright was not widely known among the public during World War II, but within the United States Navy, he was recognized as a capable and thoughtful officer who had dedicated years of service to the demanding profession of submarine warfare. His career path reflected the experiences of many naval officers who had entered the service during the interwar period, trained extensively in naval academies and fleet exercises, and eventually found themselves leading men during one of the largest conflicts in human history. Submarine commanders faced unique pressures compared with other naval officers. Unlike the captains of large surface warships who commanded fleets of sailors and powerful guns, submarine commanders operated in small, tightly coordinated crews where every decision carried immediate consequences. Inside a submarine, the captain's judgment determined the survival of the vessel. Every patrol involved risk. A submarine could operate silently beneath the water, but once detected, it became extremely vulnerable. Destroyers equipped with sonar could locate the submarine and attack with depth charges, explosive weapons designed to detonate underwater and crush the submarine's hull. Because of these dangers, submarine warfare demanded both courage and careful judgment. Earlier in the war, Enright served as executive officer aboard the American submarine USS Dace. During one patrol in 1944, Dace encountered a target that represented one of the most valuable prizes in naval warfare: a Japanese aircraft carrier. The ship was believed to be Shokaku, one of the most experienced carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Shokaku had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and had fought in numerous battles throughout the Pacific Campaign. As a frontline fleet carrier, she carried a powerful air group capable of launching devastating strikes against enemy fleets. Destroying such a vessel would have been a major strategic success. When the submarine moved into position for a possible attack, Enright faced an extremely complex tactical situation. The carrier was surrounded by escort ships that constantly scanned the surrounding waters with sonar equipment. Approaching too closely risked detection. Launching torpedoes too early might reveal the submarine's presence before a successful hit could be achieved. Timing was critical. Submarine attacks required precise calculations involving distance, target speed, angle of approach, and torpedo travel time. Even minor errors could cause torpedoes to miss completely. As Enright studied the situation through the periscope and tactical instruments, uncertainty began to build. The carrier and its escorts were maneuvering unpredictably. The firing solution was not ideal, and the risks of detection were significant. For several crucial moments, Enright hesitated. The opportunity passed. The carrier changed course and moved beyond the submarine's optimal firing position. Although the decision had been cautious rather than reckless, the consequences weighed heavily on him. Submarine commanders were expected to act decisively when opportunities appeared, and missing such a valuable target created intense personal pressure. Enright began to question his own judgment as a commander. Eventually, he made a decision that few officers were willing to make during wartime. He requested to be relieved of command. In the rigid hierarchy of the wartime Navy, this was a serious step. Many officers who stepped down from command never returned to operational leadership. Such a request could easily end a career. Yet Enright's officers saw something valuable in his honesty and willingness to accept responsibility. Rather than permanently removing him from command, they allowed him time to recover and reassess his confidence as a leader. Months later, he received another opportunity. Joseph Enright was assigned command of the submarine USS Archerfish. For him, the assignment represented more than a routine posting. It was a second chance. And soon, that second chance would lead him into one of the most extraordinary encounters in submarine warfare history. While American submarines continued to tighten their grip on Japanese shipping routes, the Imperial Japanese Navy was quietly preparing one of the most ambitious warships ever constructed. Her name was Shinano, and she represented both the engineering capabilities and the strategic desperation of Japan during the later years of the war. Shinano's origins dated back to the early years of the conflict, when naval planners around the world still believed that battleships would remain the dominant weapons of naval warfare. Massive armored ships armed with enormous guns had been the centerpiece of naval strategy for decades, and Japan was determined to build battleships that could overpower any potential opponent. As part of this strategy, Japan began constructing the Yamato-class battleships, the largest and most heavily armed warships ever built. These ships were designed to dominate traditional naval engagements. Each carried 9 massive 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a ton across distances exceeding 20 miles. Their armor plating was extraordinarily thick, designed to withstand heavy bombardment from enemy warships. Shinano was originally intended to be the third battleship of this powerful class. However, the rapid evolution of naval warfare soon forced a dramatic change in Japanese strategy. In June 1942, the Japanese Navy suffered one of its most devastating defeats during the Battle of Midway. In that single battle, 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers were destroyed by American naval aviation. The loss shocked Japanese military leadership. It demonstrated that aircraft carriers, and the aircraft they carried, had become the dominant force in modern naval warfare. Battleships, no matter how powerful their guns, could not strike targets hundreds of miles away. Aircraft could. As a result, Japanese planners urgently searched for ways to rebuild their carrier strength. The partially completed hull of Shinano offered a unique opportunity. Rather than finishing the ship as a battleship, engineers redesigned the vessel as an aircraft carrier. But Shinano would not be a conventional carrier. Instead, she was intended to function as a support carrier, capable of supplying aircraft, spare parts, and maintenance facilities to other carriers operating in the fleet. Her massive hangars could store replacement aircraft, while onboard workshops could repair damaged planes during extended naval operations. Because her hull had originally been designed for a battleship, Shinano possessed an unusually strong internal structure and heavy armor protection compared with most carriers. When completed, the ship displaced more than 72,000 tons, making her the largest aircraft carrier in the world at the time. Japanese naval leaders believed that her size and armor would make her extremely difficult to sink. However, there was one serious problem. Shinano was rushed into service before construction had been fully completed. Many internal systems remained unfinished. Some watertight doors had not been properly tested, and the crew had limited experience operating such a massive vessel. Nevertheless, the worsening military situation forced Japanese command to deploy the ship quickly. On November 28, 1944, Shinano departed Yokosuka Naval Base under heavy secrecy, escorted by several destroyers. Her destination was Kure, where final construction work would be completed before she joined the operational fleet. As the enormous carrier moved slowly through the dark waters south of Tokyo Bay, few aboard realized how vulnerable the ship truly was. And beneath the surface of the Pacific, an American submarine was already nearby. The submarine was USS Archerfish, and its commander, Joseph Enright, was about to encounter the largest warship ever attacked by a submarine.
By the early hours of November 29, 1944, the long pursuit was approaching its most critical moment. For nearly 6 hours, the American submarine USS Archerfish had been tracking a massive shadow moving steadily through the dark waters near Tokyo Bay. Commander Joseph Enright knew that opportunities like this were incredibly rare. In the vast Pacific Ocean, submarines could patrol for weeks without ever encountering a target of real strategic importance. But tonight was different. Everything about the ship ahead suggested it was something extraordinary. Through radar contacts and visual observations in the dim moonlight, the silhouette revealed an immense vessel traveling at a steady speed. Even from a distance, the shape suggested a large aircraft carrier escorted by several destroyers. The Japanese formation moved cautiously through the water, zigzagging periodically to make submarine attacks more difficult. Yet the target remained unmistakably large, much larger than any normal carrier. What Enright did not yet know was that the ship he was stalking was Shinano, one of the most secret warships ever constructed by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Originally laid down as the third Yamato-class battleship, Shinano had been converted into an aircraft carrier after Japan suffered devastating losses during the Battle of Midway in 1942. The conversion had been performed under intense wartime pressure. Japan desperately needed new carriers, and Shinano represented one of their last hopes to restore naval aviation strength in the Pacific. Workers at Yokosuka Naval Base labored day and night to complete the enormous vessel. But the rush to finish her had consequences. Although Shinano was officially commissioned, much of the ship was still incomplete. Several internal compartments were unfinished, some watertight compartments had never been fully tested, and many sections of the vessel were still undergoing final construction work. Her crew was also inexperienced. Many sailors had only recently been assigned to the ship and had not yet trained together as a full carrier crew. Damage control teams, essential for saving a ship after battle damage, had limited experience operating the complex systems aboard such a massive vessel. None of this was visible to Commander Enright. From Archerfish, he could only observe the target from miles away in the darkness. Yet the submarine commander understood one thing clearly. This was an opportunity that might never come again. Archerfish remained on the surface to maintain speed. Submarines of the era were powered by diesel engines above water, which allowed them to move much faster than when submerged. If Enright dove too soon, the carrier could easily outrun his submarine. So he continued the chase. Hour after hour, Archerfish maneuvered carefully in the darkness, adjusting course to stay ahead of the Japanese formation. The submarine's radar operators constantly monitored the distance to the target, while navigators plotted intercept calculations on charts illuminated by dim red lights. Inside the cramped control room, every crew member understood the importance of the moment. The enemy destroyers posed a constant threat. These escort ships were specifically designed to hunt submarines. Equipped with sonar and depth charges, they could turn the ocean into a deadly trap if Archerfish was detected. Occasionally, the escorts would change course abruptly, scanning the water for any sign of danger. At one point during the chase, a Japanese destroyer even approached dangerously close to Archerfish. For several tense minutes, the submarine's crew feared they had been spotted. But the destroyer eventually turned away, continuing its patrol around the carrier formation. The chase continued. Slowly, Enright began positioning Archerfish ahead of the carrier's projected course. Instead of following directly behind Shinano, he intended to move into an intercept position, allowing the carrier to come toward the submarine rather than chasing it from the rear. This maneuver required patience and precision. Too early, and the carrier might change course. Too late, and the opportunity would be lost. Finally, after hours of careful maneuvering across the Pacific surface, Enright believed the moment had arrived. The submarine was now close enough to attempt an attack, but to strike effectively, Archerfish needed to disappear beneath the waves. Enright issued the command quietly but firmly. Dive. Immediately, the submarine's crew moved into action. Valves opened, ballast tanks filled with seawater, and the vessels slowly slipped beneath the dark surface of the Pacific Ocean. Inside the submarine, the lighting shifted to dim red illumination as Archerfish descended toward periscope depth. Now the most dangerous phase of the mission would begin. Commander Enright carefully raised the periscope above the surface. Through the narrow lens, he finally saw the target clearly. Emerging from the darkness like a floating fortress was the enormous carrier Shinano, cutting through the ocean with quiet, unstoppable power. Her massive hull stretched across the water like a moving island. The range was closing rapidly. Soon, Archerfish would be directly in position, and within minutes, Commander Enright would make the decision that would change naval history forever.
Inside the submerged hull of USS Archerfish, the tension had become almost unbearable. The submarine now waited silently beneath the surface of the Pacific, positioned directly in the projected path of the enormous Japanese carrier approaching through the darkness. Commander Joseph Enright remained at the periscope, carefully tracking the target through the narrow lens. Every few seconds he adjusted the angle slightly, observing the distant silhouette cutting through the water. There was no doubt anymore. The ship ahead was massive. Even compared to other Japanese aircraft carriers Enright had studied in intelligence briefings, this vessel appeared unusually large. Its long flight deck stretched across the ocean like a floating airfield, while several escorting destroyers moved cautiously around it, scanning for submarines. But the escorts were not the real concern. The critical factor now was timing. Submarine torpedo attacks required precise calculations. Archerfish had to predict the exact position where the target would be when the torpedoes arrived. Speed, distance, and course all had to be carefully measured. A small mistake could send the torpedoes passing harmlessly ahead or behind the ship. Inside the control room, sailors worked quickly but quietly. The torpedo data computer, a mechanical device used to calculate firing solutions, was constantly adjusted as new information arrived from the periscope observations. Crew members whispered course corrections while navigators updated the attack plot. The range continued to close. 3,000 yards, 2,000, 1,500. Commander Enright knew that if Archerfish waited too long, the carrier might change course and escape the attack window. But firing too early would also reduce the chances of a successful hit. He waited for the perfect moment. Finally, at approximately 1,400 yards, Enright made his decision. The submarine was in position. The target filled the periscope view. Fire 1. A sudden mechanical jolt ran through the submarine as the first torpedo left its tube. Compressed air launched the weapon forward into the dark ocean. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. Within seconds, all 6 torpedoes were racing toward the massive carrier. Each weapon carried a powerful warhead designed to tear open the hull of even heavily armored warships. Inside Archerfish, the crew waited. Submariners called this moment running time. The torpedoes needed over a minute to reach their target. During that time, there was nothing the crew could do but listen. Silence filled the submarine. Every man aboard Archerfish understood that the next sounds would determine whether their attack succeeded or failed completely. Then, through the hull of the submarine, the first explosion echoed through the water. Boom!
A few seconds later, another violent shockwave followed. Boom! Then a third, and a fourth. Commander Enright counted them carefully. 4 hits. 4 torpedoes had struck the enormous carrier. That was more than enough to cripple almost any warship in existence. But Enright could not celebrate yet. Japanese destroyers would soon begin searching for the submarine responsible for the attack. Archerfish immediately dove deeper into the ocean, attempting to disappear before the escorts could locate them. Above the submarine, the fate of the largest aircraft carrier ever built had already begun to unfold.
Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano, the first torpedo impact struck with terrifying force. The explosion ripped into the side of the enormous vessel below the waterline, sending shockwaves through the ship's internal compartments. Moments later, 3 additional torpedoes detonated along the hull, tearing open massive sections of the carrier's side. Water immediately began flooding into multiple compartments. Although Shinano had been designed with heavy armor and advanced protection systems, the ship suffered from a critical weakness. She had been rushed into service before construction was truly complete. Many watertight doors had never been fully tested. Some sections of the internal damage control system were unfinished. Pipes, cables, and ventilation systems still ran through areas that should have been sealed during combat emergencies. As seawater poured through the damaged hull, the crew struggled to contain the flooding. Damage control teams rushed through the corridors, attempting to close bulkheads and activate pumps. But the enormous scale of the ship made coordination extremely difficult, especially for a crew that had only recently assembled. Compounding the problem was the fact that Shinano had departed Yokosuka Naval Base only hours earlier on a secret transfer mission to Kure Naval Base. Many sailors on board had never even sailed together before. The result was confusion. Some watertight doors remained open. Others could not be sealed properly due to incomplete construction work. Slowly but steadily, the carrier began taking on more water. At first, the situation appeared manageable. Shinano was designed to survive heavy damage, and her powerful engines continued pushing the ship forward across the Pacific. But below the waterline, the flooding continued spreading. Compartments that should have contained the damage were gradually overwhelmed. As water filled more sections of the hull, the carrier began developing a dangerous list to starboard. Hours passed as the crew fought desperately to save their ship. Pumps ran continuously. Emergency teams attempted to stabilize the flooding. Yet the damage was simply too severe. By early morning on November 29, 1944, the list had grown dramatically worse. Shinano's massive hull tilted further and further to one side, making it increasingly difficult for crew members to move across the decks. Eventually, the situation was irreversible. The captain gave the order to abandon ship. Sailors scrambled onto escorting destroyers while the enormous carrier slowly rolled onto its side. For a brief moment, the gigantic hull remained suspended above the water like a collapsing fortress. Then, with a roar of escaping air and rushing seawater, Shinano slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The largest aircraft carrier ever sunk by a submarine had vanished. Far away beneath the waves, USS Archerfish continued its silent escape. Commander Joseph Enright and his crew would only learn the true scale of their achievement later. At the time, they believed they had damaged a large carrier, but few could imagine they had just destroyed a 72,000-ton supercarrier, the largest warship ever sunk by submarine attack. The victory would become one of the most extraordinary moments in naval warfare history. Even 80 years later, the record still stands. No submarine has ever sunk a larger warship than Shinano, and the success of Archerfish proved something that naval strategists would never forget again. Sometimes even the most powerful warships in the world can be defeated by patience, precision, and a single perfect opportunity in the darkness of the sea. For hours, the submarine had followed its massive target through the darkness of the Pacific. Inside the control room of the USS Archerfish, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Every man understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Ahead of them sailed something enormous, a ship so large that at first many aboard the submarine struggled to believe it was real. The silhouette on the horizon stretched across the sea like a floating fortress. The Japanese carrier Shinano was moving at high speed, escorted by several destroyers, yet the crew of the Archerfish had managed to remain undetected. Using patience, skill, and careful maneuvering, the submarine slowly positioned itself for the perfect attack. Captain Joseph Enright knew opportunities like this rarely appeared twice. If the submarine moved too early, the destroyers might detect them. If they waited too long, the carrier could slip away into the darkness. Minutes passed like hours. The massive warship continued forward, unaware that beneath the surface a silent predator was waiting. Finally, the moment came. Enright gave the order. Open the outer doors. Inside the torpedo room, sailors moved quickly but quietly, preparing the weapons that would soon change naval history. 6 torpedoes were lined up in the forward tubes. Each one carried a powerful warhead designed to tear open the hull of enemy ships. The targeting calculations were completed. Distance, speed, angle, all carefully measured. The submarine adjusted its position slightly, making sure the torpedoes would intercept the carrier's path. Then the command echoed through the submarine. Fire! One by one, the torpedoes left the tubes. Each launch created a brief vibration through the hull of the submarine. 6 steel weapons surged forward into the dark water, racing toward the enormous carrier above. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Inside the Archerfish, the crew counted the seconds. Every man listened. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds. Then it happened. A deep explosion rolled through the ocean. Moments later, another, and another. 4 torpedoes slammed into the side of the Shinano. From the submarine's periscope, the crew watched as towering columns of water and flame erupted along the massive ship's hull. The largest aircraft carrier ever built had just been mortally wounded. But the battle was not yet over. At first, the Shinano seemed capable of surviving the attack. The ship was enormous, built with thick armor and powerful internal compartments designed to resist damage. Japanese officers believed the carrier could absorb several torpedo hits and continue sailing. But the reality inside the ship was far worse. The torpedoes had struck critical sections of the hull, opening large gaps that allowed seawater to pour inside. Flooding spread rapidly through multiple compartments. Damage control teams rushed through the corridors, trying to contain the leaks, sealing bulkheads and pumping water from the lower decks. But the ship had a hidden weakness. Shinano had been rushed into service before construction was fully completed. Many internal systems were unfinished, and some watertight doors were not properly sealed. As water continued to rush inside, the carrier slowly began to list. At first, the tilt was small, but it kept growing. On board, confusion began to spread. Some officers believed the situation could still be controlled. Others realized the truth. The giant carrier was dying. Below the surface, the USS Archerfish continued to watch from a distance. The submarine maintained silent observation as the wounded ship struggled across the ocean. Hour after hour, the list increased. The massive warship that had been designed to dominate the Pacific was now fighting for survival. Eventually, the angle became too severe. Aircraft equipment slid across hangar decks, machinery broke loose, water flooded deeper into the hull. Finally, the inevitable moment arrived. The Shinano rolled heavily to one side. Then, slowly, the gigantic carrier began to sink. The ocean closed over one of the largest warships ever constructed.
More than 1,400 sailors were lost in the disaster. For the crew of the USS Archerfish, the mission had been extraordinary. A single submarine had destroyed the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval warfare. The event became one of the most remarkable naval victories of World War II. Even today, the story of the Archerfish remains a powerful reminder of how a small and silent hunter beneath the waves changed the fate of a giant warship. In the vast Pacific Ocean, one submarine had rewritten history.